a parched throat, a whispered plea, and a defiant act of kindness against the stark backdrop of an unforgiving land. A simple offering of water to a dying warrior could shatter the fragile peace of a solitary woman's life. What unseen debts are forged in moments of desperation, and what shadows do they cast when the morning light spills over the horizon, revealing an impossible siege? Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. The sun was a brutal, unyielding fist in the western sky, pounding down on the cracked earth, leaching all moisture, all hope, from the very air Alara breathed. Her small, weathered cabin, a defiant speck in the vast, desolate expanse, offered little solace against the relentless heat. A solitary sentinel in a land that seemed to resent any human presence. She moved through the day with a practiced efficiency, born of years spent wresting sustenance from the arid ground. Her hands calloused, her face etched with the lines of sun and sorrow. It was a life of quiet endurance, punctuated only by the mournful whisper of the wind through the sagebrush and the distant, mournful cries of unseen birds. Yet, even in this harsh solitude, a tremor of unease often vibrated beneath the surface of her calm, a premonition of something yet to arrive, something that would tear at the frayed edges of her carefully constructed peace. The land was a canvas of muted browns and ochres, but tonight, as dusk bled into the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and violent violet, an alien stillness descended, heavier than the heat. She was out collecting the last of the day's firewood, her arms already aching from the labor, when she saw him, a dark, still form huddled amongst the scrub, barely distinguishable from the shadows that lengthened with the dying light. Her first instinct was a sharp recoil, a surge of primal fear that tightened her throat and sent a cold dread through her veins. This was Navajo land, and though she had built her life here, an unspoken tension, an historical bruise, always lingered in the air between the settlers and the tribes. He was clearly a warrior, even in his diminished state, adorned with the remnants of traditional attire, his face painted with ochre and black, now streaked with dust and the grim evidence of a violent struggle. He was dying. She saw it in the shallow, rattling breaths that tore from his chest, in the glaze over his eyes, in the unnaturally rigid angle of his body. A spear wound, vicious and deep, blossomed darkly on his side, a testament to the brutal realities of this unforgiving frontier. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over her. Fear, yes, but also a profound, unexpected pang of something akin to pity. This was not the enemy of her nightmares, but a man, broken and teetering on the precipice of oblivion. The memory of her younger brother, feverish and gasping for water during a cruel drought that had ravaged their first settlement, flickered through her mind like a ghost, a raw wound that never truly healed. It was a moment of stark, almost unbearable clarity. The instinct for self-preservation screamed at her to turn away, to leave him to his fate, to disappear into the fading light and pretend she had seen nothing. But the vision of her brother's dying eyes, the desperate plea in their depths for just one drop, held her captive. She knelt, slowly, deliberately, the dry earth crunching beneath her knees, a silent act of defiance against the harsh doctrines of survival she had always known. The canteen, her only source of hydration, felt heavy in her trembling hand, a vessel of both life and potential doom. She offered it, the cool metal, a stark contrast to the burning air, a fragile bridge between two worlds locked in an eternal bloody struggle. He did not stir immediately, his eyes, dark and haunted, fixed on some unseen point beyond her, beyond the encroaching darkness. A guttural sound, barely audible, escaped his lips, a mixture of pain and disbelief. He seemed to understand her intent, yet the gesture was so alien, so unexpected in this brutal landscape, that it seemed to stun him more than the wound itself. She felt a profound sadness then, a quiet ache for the endless cycles of violence that made such a simple act revolutionary, a dangerous gamble. Slowly, painstakingly, he reached for it, his fingers brushing hers, a fleeting connection that sent a jolt through her arm. He drank, slow and agonizing, each swallow a victory against the encroaching darkness, the water a visible tremor against the dust-caked skin of his throat. He did not speak, could not, but his eyes, when they finally met hers, held a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher. Gratitude, perhaps, or a question, or a warning. The silence stretched, thick and pregnant with unspoken histories, with the weight of choices made and paths taken. Then, with a final, shuddering breath, he released the canteen, his hand falling back to the earth. She pulled back, her heart hammering against her ribs. The simple act of offering water now completed, but the true consequences, she knew, had only just begun to unfold. The last embers of the sunset died, plunging the world into a deep, velvety black, and she was left alone with the dying man and the chilling question of what the new day would bring. The desert air, once still, began to stir, carrying on its nascent currents, not the scent of dust and sage, but something else, something metallic and foreboding. The quiet hum of the land, once a comfort, now felt like a held breath. The hours that followed were a torturous, drawn-out eternity, each tick of the old grandfather clock inside her cabin, a hammer blow against the fragile walls of her composure. Ilara barricaded the door, not out of any real conviction that it would hold against determined men, but as a desperate, ritualistic act of defiance against the encroaching dread. The small, familiar space of her home, usually a sanctuary from the howling wilderness, now felt like a cage, its walls pressing in, suffocating her with their silence. She sat by the window, the rough-hewn curtains pulled back just enough to allow her a sliver of vision into the moonless night, her rifle clutched tight in her trembling hands. Every shadow that danced across the barren landscape seemed to hold a hidden menace. Every whisper of the wind through the dry grass sounded like approaching footsteps. The image of the warrior, his tormented eyes fixed on hers, was burned into her mind, an indelible mark. What had she done? What incomprehensible line had she crossed? Had she just sealed her own doom? Or, worse, invited a tragedy upon her isolated existence? A flashback, sudden and sharp as a shard of glass, pierced the tense stillness of the night. She saw her father, his face etched with grim determination, standing over a shallow grave, the earth freshly turned, hiding the meager remains of their first 2 years of crops, withered and dead under the relentless sun. "This land, Ilara," he had said, his voice raw with defeat, "it gives nothing without taking something greater in return." And it had taken everything. Her mother, her younger brother, and finally, her father himself, broken by the endless struggle against a land that refused to yield. She had stayed, stubbornly, defiantly, clinging to the small patch of dust, as if it were the last tether to her family, to a semblance of meaning in a world that had stripped her bare. This isolation, this barren existence, was not a choice, but a consequence, a self-imposed penance for a past she couldn't outrun. She had learned then, bitter lessons etched into her very bones, that compassion was a luxury, a weakness, in a world that rewarded only the ruthless. Yet, she had offered water to an enemy. The irony was a bitter taste in her mouth. The night stretched, a relentless, suffocating blanket of suspense. She heard nothing, saw nothing, and yet the air vibrated with an unspoken presence, a certainty that the world outside was no longer empty. The silence itself became a character in her ordeal, a mocking, expectant entity. Every strained breath she took seemed to echo unnaturally loud in the small room. Her mind raced, a frantic kaleidoscope of scenarios, each more terrifying than the last. Would they burn her out? Would they take her captive? Would they simply kill her in the dead of night, leaving her body to bleach under the same sun that had nurtured and then destroyed her family? The desperation in the warrior's eyes, the fleeting touch of his fingers, had instilled in her not a sense of moral victory, but a chilling premonition of retribution. He was one of them, a part of the tribe that saw her, and all settlers like her, as an invasive blight upon their ancestral lands. The stories, whispered around campfires and told in hushed tones in dusty frontier towns, were always of raids, of massacres, of retaliations that left no stone unturned, no life spared. The fear was a tangible thing, a cold knot in her stomach, twisting and tightening with each passing second. She had always believed in clear lines, in the unambiguous distinctions between right and wrong, settler and native, friend and foe. But the warrior, dying at her feet, had blurred those lines. smudged them with the stark reality of human suffering. He was a man, bleeding, gasping for life, regardless of the paint on his face or the language he spoke. And she, in her fleeting moment of raw humanity, had responded not to the enemy, but to the dying plea of a fellow creature. This act, so simple, so profoundly human, had shattered the convenient narrative she had built around her isolated existence. It wasn't about heroics. It was about an involuntary impulse that now threatened to consume her. The night began to bleed into the faintest hint of dawn, a bruised purple on the eastern horizon. The stars, once sharp pinpricks of light, began to fade, their cold, indifferent gaze replaced by the first, tentative tendrils of a new day. A day that would, she knew with a sickening certainty, bring the reckoning. The silence outside deepened, becoming pregnant with expectation, a vast, held breath. And then, as the first sliver of the sun's fiery rim appeared above the distant mountains, casting long, skeletal shadows across the land, she saw them. They were everywhere. The morning light, once a harbinger of hope, now spilled across the desolate landscape like spilled blood, revealing the impossible truth. They were there, silent, resolute, surrounding her cabin in a grim, impenetrable circle. A sea of dark, unmoving figures, stark against the nascent gold of the rising sun. Her breath hitched, catching in her throat, a small, desperate gasp swallowed by the vast silence of the desert. There were dozens of them, maybe more, spread out in a wide, deliberate perimeter, their faces impassive, their weapons held loosely, but with unmistakable purpose. They were warriors, like the one she had helped, their features etched with the same stoic defiance, their eyes, even from this distance, conveying an unsettling intensity. The air crackled with a palpable tension, a silent standoff that hummed with the potential for explosive violence. It was a tableau of ancient confrontation, a clash of worlds played out on the stage of her small, vulnerable home. Alara's mind reeled, a frantic, desperate scramble for understanding. Her fingers, still wrapped around the cold steel of her rifle, felt numb, disconnected. This was not a raid, not the swift, brutal attack she had anticipated. This was a siege, a deliberate act of containment, of judgment. Their stillness was more terrifying than any war cry, their silent presence more unnerving than a volley of arrows. It spoke of a power she could not comprehend, a patience born of generations of waiting, of watching. The sun climbed higher, casting long, distorted shadows of the warriors across the dust, transforming them into silent, towering giants, guardians of a threshold she had unknowingly violated. Each figure was a question, an accusation, a silent witness to her desperate act of mercy. Was this their vengeance? Had her small, human kindness been mistaken for a declaration of war, an intentional insult? The irony was a cruel twist in her gut. She had tried to save a life, and now her own hung by the thinnest thread. The hours crawled, marked only by the shifting light and the relentless pounding of her own heart. She watched them, and they watched her, a silent, grim communion across the barren ground. There was no movement, no communication, just the oppressive weight of their presence. She strained her ears for any sound, any word, anything that would give her a clue to their intentions, but there was nothing. Only the mournful cry of a distant hawk, a stark reminder of the vast, indifferent wilderness that surrounded them all. Her own isolation, usually a source of comfort, now felt like an unbearable burden, a cage that trapped her with her own terrible choices. She was alone, utterly and completely, with the consequences of her compassion. The world outside had narrowed to the perimeter of her cabin, a small, fragile circle of fear and uncertainty. She remembered her father's warnings about the tribes, tales of their ferocity, their unforgiving nature, their unyielding demand for justice. He had painted them as savage, as inhuman, as an untamed force of nature to be feared and eradicated. Yet, the warrior's dying plea, the flicker of raw humanity in his eyes, had shattered those carefully constructed narratives. The silence was a language, a form of communication more potent than any shouted threat. It spoke of deep-seated grievances, of ancient wounds, of a profound imbalance that had festered for generations. Ilara was a white woman, a settler, a symbol of the encroaching world that had stolen their land, decimated their people, and ravaged their traditions. Her individual act, however well-intentioned, could be nothing more than a ripple in the vast, turbulent ocean of history. They were not there for her, not truly. They were there for what she represented, for the endless stream of trespassers who had carved a life from land that was not theirs. The weight of that collective history pressed down on her, an unbearable burden of guilt and complicity. Even though she herself had arrived with nothing but a desperate hope for survival, she saw the glint of sunlight on obsidian, the feathers tied into their hair, the stoic lines of their faces, and she knew, with chilling certainty, that this was not a matter of a single interaction, but of an entire world poised on the brink. The dust, disturbed by their silent arrival, hung in the air, a shimmering veil between her fragile existence and their implacable resolve. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken questions, with the ghosts of past conflicts. She was trapped, not just by their physical presence, but by the relentless, suffocating tide of history. The sun continued its relentless climb, marking the slow, agonizing passage of time, each second a hammer blow against the dwindling reserves of her courage. Her hands tightened around the rifle, knuckles white, a futile gesture of defense against a force that transcended mere weaponry. Hours bled into days, the standoff settling into a grim, silent ritual. Alara's world shrunk to the confines of her cabin, her existence defined by the perimeter of silent warriors outside. Hunger gnawed at her, and thirst, a familiar torment in this arid land, began its slow, insidious creep. She conserved her meager supplies, each sip of water, each bite of dried meat, a desperate gamble against an uncertain future. The silence, once a source of terror, now became a form of psychological torture, a constant, unrelenting pressure that threatened to unravel her mind. She watched them, always watching, for any sign, any movement, any deviation from their unnerving stillness. They never spoke, never moved, a living, breathing wall of unyielding resolve. Their patience was a terrifying weapon, a testament to a deep-seated purpose she could not yet fathom. The weight of their presence, the unspoken accusation in their eyes, pressed down on her, suffocating and relentless. She tried to communicate once, a desperate, hoarse cry across the barren expanse. "What do you want?" Her voice, raw and cracked, sounded alien in the vast silence, swallowed by the desert air as if it had never been uttered. There was no response, not even a flicker of movement among the silent figures. They simply watched, their gazes, like polished obsidian, reflecting back only her own fear and desperation. It was then she understood, with a chilling clarity, that this was not a negotiation. This was a statement, a grim declaration. She was not meant to speak, but to listen, to witness, to bear the weight of their silent judgment. The air shimmered with the heat, distorting their forms, making them appear even more spectral, more implacable. Her cabin, once a symbol of her independence, now felt like a lonely island, marooned in an ocean of unspoken hostility. She began to see the land differently, not as a wilderness to be tamed, but as a living entity, its dust and rocks saturated with the history of blood and tears, of displacement and injustice. The silence of the warriors was not an absence of sound, but a profound, resonant echo of generations of suffering. A fragment of a memory surfaced, unbidden, like a ghost from the depths of her subconscious. It was a dusty marketplace, years ago, when her family had first arrived. A young Navajo woman, wrapped in a faded blanket, selling intricate baskets woven from local reeds. A settler, red-faced and boisterous, had kicked over her stall, scattering her wares, shouting epithets about savages and lazy thieves. Her father, a quiet man, had simply turned away, urging Alara to do the same, to avoid trouble. "They are not our kind, Alara," he had said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Keep to yourself." That memory, that quiet complicity, now burned with shame. She had not stood up, had not intervened, had simply internalized the dismissive prejudice of the age. Was this, now, her retribution? The dying warrior she had helped, a symbol of a people she had once dismissed, now held her fate in his silent hands. The irony was a bitter taste, a galling reminder of the narrowness of her past understanding. The stoic faces of the warriors outside, though devoid of overt emotion, spoke volumes. Their stillness was a testament to their strength, their unyielding spirit. She could feel the weight of their collective gaze, 1,000 eyes silently judging her, weighing her worth, measuring her against the scales of history. The air was thick with the dust of generations, with the unspoken grievances of a people pushed to the brink. She was not just Alara, the solitary woman. She was a representative, a symbol, a tiny, vulnerable piece in a much larger, more tragic tapestry of conflict. The sun, a brutal, indifferent eye, continued its relentless arc across the sky, painting the cabin in stark relief, a solitary beacon in the vastness of the desert, isolated and exposed. She watched them, not as individual men, but as a singular, powerful entity, their unspoken purpose vibrating in the very air she breathed. The weight of their presence pressed down on her, a physical manifestation of the unresolved tension between two worlds, two ways of life, each believing in its own righteousness, each scarred by the other's existence. The silence, unbroken, stretched taut, a drumbeat of suspense, waiting for the inevitable crack, the moment when the fragile peace would finally shatter. The desert, unforgiving and vast, bore witness to the silent drama unfolding beneath its endless sky, a grim stage for a reckoning that had been brewing for centuries. On the third morning of the standoff, a subtle shift occurred. The oppressive stillness that had defined their presence, the unblinking, unmoving vigil, finally fractured. One of the warriors, a tall, imposing figure whose face bore the weathered lines of a seasoned elder, detached himself from the silent perimeter. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his footsteps barely disturbing the dust, approaching the cabin with a quiet authority that bespoke a deep purpose. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was it, the moment she had been dreading, the breaking of the terrible silence. Her grip tightened on the rifle, knuckles white, the cold steel a small comfort against the surge of primal fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She pressed herself against the rough-hewn window frame, her eyes, wide and fearful, tracking his every move. He stopped perhaps 20 paces from the cabin, a distance that felt both impossibly close and achingly far. Then, with a slow, measured movement, he raised his hand, palm open, in a gesture that was undeniably a cessation of hostilities, an invitation to a different kind of encounter. He spoke then, his voice low and resonant, the words alien to her ears, a cascade of unfamiliar sounds that carried the weight of ancient rhythms and deep-seated meaning. He pointed, first towards the sun, then towards the ground, then to the north, a series of deliberate gestures that, despite her lack of comprehension, seemed to convey a narrative, a story being told in the language of the land itself. She could not understand the words, but she felt the profound weight of their utterance, the gravity of the moment. He paused, his gaze fixed on her cabin, his eyes unreadable, then repeated a single word, sharp and guttural, that resonated with an eerie familiarity. He then gestured towards the ground near his feet, indicating something there, something unseen by Alara. A second warrior, younger, leaner, stepped forward, carrying a bundle wrapped in dark leather. He knelt, carefully, and unwrapped the bundle to reveal a collection of objects, a feathered headdress, intricate and vibrant, a polished stone, smooth and dark, and a small, intricately carved wooden figure. The elder spoke again, his voice carrying a mournful timbre, his gaze sweeping across the land, then back to the cabin. His gestures became more emphatic, pointing to the objects, then to the earth, then to the north where the mountains lay like slumbering giants. Then he pointed directly at her cabin, his expression solemn, unwavering. The meaning was still shrouded in mystery, but a new thread began to weave itself into the tapestry of her fear, a subtle undercurrent of something other than outright hostility. There was a solemnity to their actions, a ritualistic gravity that transcended mere aggression. This was not a demand for blood, not yet. It was something deeper, something tied to their beliefs, to their history, to the very spirit of the land. The younger warrior then stood, and with surprising gentleness, held up a small hand-carved wooden bird. It was simple, yet exquisitely detailed. Its wings outstretched as if in flight. He held it up, and then, with a slow, deliberate motion, placed it on the ground at the elder's feet. The elder then extended his hand, palm open, towards her cabin once more. He spoke again, and this time, his words, though still incomprehensible, seemed to carry a fragile offer, a silent plea for understanding. The air, which had been thick with tension, now held a delicate balance, poised between conflict and something else, something unspoken. Alara, watching from the darkness of her cabin, felt a profound shift within her. The stereotype of the savage, the untamed warrior, began to crumble, replaced by the image of men acting with purpose, with ritual, with a silent dignity that demanded respect, even in the face of fear. She still did not know what they wanted, but she knew, with chilling certainty, that it was far more complex than simple vengeance. The sun, climbing higher, cast a long, unbroken shadow from the elder, a dark finger, pointing directly at her, at the cabin, at the heart of the silent, unfolding drama. The land held its breath, waiting. The elder's words, though a foreign tongue to Alara, resonated with a deep, ancestral cadence, a lament that transcended language barriers. He pointed again to the objects laid out on the ground. The feathered headdress, a symbol of honor and lineage. The dark, polished stone, perhaps a sacred relic. The intricately carved wooden figure, an effigy of some spiritual significance. Each gesture, each mournful phrase, was a stroke in a narrative that she could not decipher, yet whose tragic weight pressed down on her with an almost unbearable force. It was a story told in silence and solemnity, a profound communication of loss and purpose. The air vibrated with a sense of ritual, a quiet ceremony unfolding beneath the indifferent gaze of the desert sun. He then pointed to the north, towards the distant, jagged peaks of the mountains, their silhouettes sharp against the pale sky. His voice lowered, becoming a guttural whisper, filled with a sorrow that needed no translation. It was then, in a blinding flash of understanding, that the fragmented pieces of the puzzle began to click into place. The warrior she had helped, the dying man she had offered water to, he was not just any warrior. He was someone of immense significance, perhaps a chief, a spiritual leader, or a hero. The objects laid out before her, the solemnity of the elder's demeanor, the presence of the entire tribe, it was a mourning procession, a final tribute. The wounded warrior, the one she had saved, was meant to be carried to the sacred burial grounds in the mountains, but he was alive. Her act of compassion, meant to alleviate suffering, had inadvertently interfered with a sacred rite, a journey to the spirit world. The weight of this realization was crushing, a fresh burden of guilt settling upon her already weary shoulders. She had not only broken a cycle of violence by offering aid, she had, perhaps, defiled a spiritual passage. The irony was a bitter, scalding draft. A new wave of fear, colder and more profound than the initial dread of attack, washed over her. She had not simply offered water to a dying man, she had tethered a spirit meant for the afterlife back to the mortal coil, a transgression of immense proportions in a culture steeped in ancestral reverence. The elder, now pointing emphatically towards the mountains, then back to the cabin, made his unspoken demand clear. They wanted the warrior. They wanted to complete his journey, to allow his spirit to rest. And her presence, her isolated cabin, her very act of intervention, was an obstacle, a defiant challenge to their sacred traditions. The young warrior, holding the wooden bird, now placed it carefully next to the other objects, then extended his open hand towards the cabin, a silent, unwavering invitation, not an invitation to parley, but an expectation, a silent demand for the one she had saved. The silence that followed the elder's mournful pronouncements was thick with expectation, a heavy, palpable force that pressed against the flimsy walls of Alara's cabin. She understood now, with a chilling clarity that pierced through her fear. This was not about revenge for past grievances, not directly. It was about a profound spiritual disruption, a sacred ceremony interrupted by a single, desperate act of human kindness. The warrior, her unexpected patient, was not just a man, he was a vessel, a conduit to the ancestral world, and she had inadvertently anchored him to the profane. The burden of his life, now resting on her hands, felt heavier than any weapon. The elder, having delivered his silent message, now turned to the other warriors, his gaze sweeping over them, a silent command in his eyes. A shift rippled through the gathered figures. They began to move, slowly, deliberately, forming a new, tighter perimeter around the cabin. Not an aggressive formation, but a solemn cordon, a human barrier that spoke of unwavering resolve. The air, already thick with tension, now hummed with a quiet intensity, a sense of an inevitable progression towards a climax she could no longer evade. The sun, now high above, cast long, distorted shadows of the warriors, making them appear like ancient, unyielding statues, rooted to the very earth. Alara's gaze was drawn back to the warrior she had saved, still inside, lying where she had dragged him, partially concealed by the shadow of the cabin wall. He was weak, still clinging to life by the thinnest thread, but he was undeniably alive. A guttural cough escaped him, a wet, rattling sound that seemed to mock the stillness outside, a stark reminder of the fragile balance between life and death. The wound on his side, though tended as best she could, was still a testament to the brutal realities of his ordeal. What did they intend? Would they simply take him? Or would her obstruction be met with a swift, merciless retribution? Her mind raced, a desperate kaleidoscope of scenarios, each one tinged with the stark reality of her impossible situation. The options were few, and none promised salvation. The irony of her situation was a bitter taste in her mouth. She, a solitary woman, had dared to meddle with forces far beyond her comprehension, to disrupt a spiritual balance she had not even known existed. Her compassion, an impulse born of a shared humanity, now threatened to undo her entirely. The desert wind, a mournful whisper through the sagebrush, seemed to carry the weight of generations of unspoken sorrows, of ancient grievances between two peoples. The warriors outside, their faces impassive, were not mere aggressors. They were guardians of a sacred trust, of a path that had been followed since time immemorial. The decision, she knew, rested entirely on her. To release him was to surrender, to acknowledge her transgression. To refuse was to invite a confrontation that she could not possibly win. The silence stretched, taut and unbroken, a crucible in which her choices would be forged. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of fiery orange and bruised purple, a grim backdrop to the unfolding drama. The shadows lengthened, swallowing the cabin in their embrace, a silent, powerful testament to the impending darkness, to the irreversible nature of the choice she was about to make. The fate of the warrior, and perhaps her own, hung precariously in the balance, suspended between life and the demands of the spirit world. The choice, stark and unforgiving, coalesced in Alara's mind, a brutal clarity born of desperation and the profound weight of the surrounding silence. She could fight, a futile gesture against impossible odds, ending in bloodshed she instinctively recoiled from, or she could yield, and in doing so, surrender her own autonomy, her very life, to the unknown intentions of the tribe. Yet, a deeper understanding, a shift in perspective, began to emerge from the depths of her fear. This was not a conquest. It was a demand for balance, for the restoration of a disrupted sacred path. Her act of kindness, however pure in its intent, had inadvertently caused a profound spiritual imbalance. The desert, unforgiving and vast, was not just a stage for conflict, but a silent witness to a fundamental struggle between life and the journey to the ancestors. With a heavy heart, a decision, agonizing and inevitable, solidified within her. She moved away from the window, the image of the silent warriors seared into her mind, and approached the warrior she had kept within her cabin. He lay still, his breathing shallow, a flicker of life tenuously clinging to his battered form. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she touched his brow, feeling the clammy coolness of his skin, the faint pulse beneath her fingers. He was fading, slowly but surely, despite her efforts. The water, the bandages, the brief respite from the elements, they had prolonged his life, but they had not healed him. His journey was not meant to be delayed. It was meant to be completed. The realization was a painful one, a profound irony. Her act of compassion, meant to preserve life, had only prolonged suffering and disrupted a sacred passage. She rose, her movements slow and deliberate, each step a profound acknowledgement of her role in this intricate, unfolding drama. She unbarred the heavy wooden door, the sound of the protesting hinges echoing unnaturally loud in the profound silence. The harsh sunlight flooded the small cabin, momentarily blinding her, but she stepped out, blinking, into the vast, open space of the desert. She stood on the threshold, a solitary figure against the immensity of the land, her hands empty, raised slightly, palms open, in a gesture of surrender and acknowledgement. The elder, still standing at the designated spot, watched her, his gaze unwavering, inscrutable. The other warriors, though still silent, seemed to hold their breath, their stillness magnified by the enormity of the moment. Ilara turned back into the cabin, her voice, though hoarse, carrying a surprising strength. "He is here," she said, her words swallowed by the vastness, directed not at the warriors, but at the very spirit of the land, at the silent agreement between life and death. She bent, and with a strength she didn't know she possessed, she carefully lifted the warrior, cradling his weakened body in her arms. He was light, almost insubstantial, a testament to his fading life force. His eyes fluttered open for a moment, fixing on hers with a flicker of recognition, a brief, silent communion that spoke of gratitude and perhaps a deep understanding of her sacrifice. He did not resist, his body pliant, accepting his fate, his journey. Carrying him, she slowly stepped out of the cabin, onto the bare earth, her movements measured, heavy with the weight of her choice. The sun beat down on her, a relentless, burning presence, but she ignored it, her focus solely on the fragile life cradled in her arms. She moved towards the elder, towards the silent warriors, her footsteps stirring the dust, each one a testament to the profound transformation within her. This was not a defeat, not truly. It was an acknowledgement, a surrender not of her life, but of her limited understanding, of her inability to comprehend the ancient paths of this sacred land. As she approached, the elder raised his hand, not in a gesture of aggression, but of solemn acceptance, a silent affirmation of her act. The air hummed with a quiet tension, the climax of the standoff now upon them, a silent negotiation between two worlds, two understandings of life and death, culminating in a single profound act of resolution. The journey was not yet over, but the path forward, though shrouded in uncertainty, had finally revealed itself. As Ilara approached the elder, the warrior cradled in her arms. A low, guttural murmur rippled through the assembled Navajo figures. It was not a sound of triumph, nor of anger, but of a deep, resonant grief, a collective sorrow that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath their feet. The elder's gaze, previously unreadable, softened imperceptibly, a flicker of something akin to acknowledgement passing through his ancient eyes. He extended his hands, calloused and strong, a silent invitation to transfer the burden. Ilara, her arms aching but her resolve firm, gently lowered the warrior into his waiting embrace. The contact was brief, a silent passing of responsibility, a fragile bridge built between two disparate worlds. The elder, holding the warrior with a reverence that spoke of deep love and respect, turned and began to walk, slowly, deliberately, towards the north, towards the distant mountains where the sacred burial grounds lay. The other warriors fell in behind him, forming a solemn procession, their footsteps light upon the dusty ground, their presence a quiet testament to the gravity of their purpose. They moved with a singular focus, their eyes fixed on the horizon, their bodies a living shield around their precious burden. Ilara watched them go, a solitary figure standing in the merciless glare of the sun, the emptiness in her arms a profound ache that was both physical and spiritual. The air, which had been thick with tension, now felt strangely hollow, imbued with the lingering echoes of their departure. The silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now, not the oppressive, menacing quiet of the siege, but a vast, contemplative stillness, pregnant with the weight of what had just transpired. She was alone again, truly alone, but the world had shifted on its axis, transformed by the profound encounter. As the last of the warriors disappeared over the distant rise, a faint, almost imperceptible sound reached her ears. It was the sound of a voice, soft and guttural, carried on the wind, uttering a single word. It was the warrior she had helped. A final, whispered utterance as he was carried towards his ancestors. A word that, through some inexplicable connection, resonated with a profound sense of closure, of understanding. She stood there for a long time, rooted to the spot, feeling the earth breathe beneath her feet, the immense sky stretching endlessly above. The cabin, her lonely sanctuary, now felt both familiar and strangely alien, a witness to a transformation she could not yet fully grasp. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of fiery gold and bruised purple, a poignant backdrop to the unfolding quiet. The resolution had been hard-won, a negotiation not of words, but of profound gestures and unspoken understanding. The darkness and tension of the standoff had given way not to joyful relief, but to a somber, reflective peace. She had confronted her deepest fears, shattered her ingrained prejudices, and offered compassion in the face of an almost certain demise. Her act of kindness, born of a raw, human instinct, had inadvertently set in motion a chain of events that tested her moral core, forcing her to confront the complex, often brutal, realities of the land and its ancient inhabitants. The memory of the warrior's eyes, the fleeting touch of his hand, would forever be etched into her mind, a silent reminder of the fragile interconnectedness of all life. The land, once a place of fear and struggle, now felt vast and ancient, its secrets deepened, its lessons etched into the very core of her being. The days that followed were filled with a profound stillness, a quiet contemplation of what had transpired. Elara moved through her solitary routine with a new rhythm, her actions imbued with a deepened sense of purpose. The cabin, once a cage, now felt like a vessel for quiet reflection, a space where the echoes of the standoff lingered like ghosts. She spent long hours gazing at the northern mountains, the direction the procession had taken, imagining the sacred journey, the warrior finally finding peace among his ancestors. The desert wind, once a mournful lament, now seemed to carry a different song, a whisper of understanding, a testament to the enduring spirit of the land and its people. She felt a profound shift within her, a shedding of the hardened layers of fear and prejudice that had once defined her existence. The act of offering water, once a simple gesture, had spiraled into a complex moral crucible, forcing her to confront the ingrained biases of her world and the deep-seated grievances of another. The irony of her situation, the simple act of mercy leading to a monumental confrontation, continued to reverberate within her. She had not chosen to be a catalyst for understanding, but had been thrust into that role by the sheer, overwhelming force of human need. The fear had subsided, replaced by a quiet awe for the resilience of the human spirit, both her own and that of the tribe. The hopeful resolution was not a grand triumph, but a subtle, internal shift, a blossoming of empathy in a landscape that had long nurtured only the bitter fruits of conflict. She began to see the desert not as an adversary, but as a silent, ancient teacher, its vastness holding countless stories, its rocks and dust saturated with the history of struggle and survival. The sun, still a brutal presence, now seemed to warm her skin with a different intent, a gentle reminder of the enduring cycles of life and death, of beginnings and endings. The scar on her hand, a small faded mark from a childhood accident, now felt like a counterpart to an unseen wound, the invisible scar etched onto her soul by the events of those harrowing days. It was a mark of transformation, a reminder that vulnerability could be a source of strength, that compassion, even when fraught with peril, could forge unexpected connections. The quiet hum of the land, once a source of unease, now felt like a comforting presence, a lullaby of ancient wisdom. She knew her life would never be the same. The isolation remained, but it was no longer a burden. It was a space for reflection, for the slow, arduous process of rebuilding her understanding of the world. The memory of the Navajo warrior, his dying gaze, the silent power of his tribe, would forever be a part of her, a profound lesson in the intricate tapestry of human experience. The story was not of grand heroics, but of the quiet, almost imperceptible shifts within a solitary soul, the breaking down of barriers, the forging of understanding in the crucible of fear. The desert remained, vast and indifferent. But Ilara now saw it through different eyes. Eyes that held a flicker of hope, a nascent understanding of the profound interconnectedness of all things. Her cabin, a small beacon in the immensity, stood as a testament to the quiet strength of compassion, a symbol of a fragile peace forged in the fires of conflict. The lessons learned were etched into the very fabric of her being, a profound and lasting transformation born from a single, simple act of kindness against the stark backdrop of an unforgiving world, forever changed by the ripple of water on parched lips. The wind, a constant companion, whispered new stories through the sagebrush, tales of understanding and resilience, echoing the quiet hope that had finally found root in the desolate landscape. The air, though still dry, now held a faint, almost imperceptible softness, a gentle breath that stirred the dust around her cabin. Ilara, having lived through the harrowing standoff, now moved with a quiet dignity, her solitude no longer a burden but a chosen space for profound reflection. The image of the Navajo warrior, carried silently into the northern mountains, remained vivid in her mind, a powerful symbol of the complex interplay between life and ancestral duty. His journey, prolonged by her compassion, had ultimately found its sacred completion, and in doing so, had paved the way for a deeper understanding between two disparate worlds. The silence that had once filled her days with dread now settled around her like a blanket of peace, a quiet hum that spoke of equilibrium restored, of ancient balances respected. She had faced not just an external threat, but the internal shadows of her own prejudices, emerging from the crucible of the standoff with a transformed spirit. The subtle shifts in the landscape, once unnoticed, now resonated with deeper meaning. The way the light struck the ancient rocks, the whisper of the wind through the tall grasses, the distant cries of the desert creatures, all seemed to speak a language of enduring resilience, of life persisting against all odds. Her cabin, once a fragile bastion against the unknown, now stood as a silent testament to a bridge built between cultures, an unlikely sanctuary where an act of mercy had forged an unexpected understanding. She found herself watching the horizon not with fear, but with a quiet contemplation, an acceptance of the vast, untamed beauty of the land. The memory of her family, lost to the unforgiving desert, no longer carried the sharp sting of bitterness, but a melancholic echo of shared struggle, a testament to the human desire for a place to call home. She understood now that this land belonged to no one, and to everyone, its ownership not a matter of fences and deeds, but of respect and harmonious coexistence. The weight of history, the deep-seated conflicts between her people and the native tribes, had been intensely felt during the siege, but the resolution, however quiet and unheralded, had offered a glimmer of hope, a fragile possibility of a different future. It was a reminder that even in the most desolate of circumstances, an act of humanity could transcend centuries of animosity, laying the groundwork for a profound, if unspoken, peace. Ilara's character, once defined by her flaws and her isolation, had been forged anew, tempered by the fires of fear and the illuminating light of compassion. She had learned that true strength lay not in defiance, but in understanding, not in control, but in empathy. Her world had expanded beyond the narrow confines of her own survival, embracing the wider, more intricate tapestry of existence in this ancient, unforgiving land. The poetic undertones of her solitary life deepened. The desert became a canvas of vast, unspoken stories, its every dune and canyon holding secrets centuries old. She would often stand outside the cabin at dawn, watching the sun paint the sky in fiery hues, and she would think of the warrior, of the elder, of the silent procession that had carried a soul home. It was a profound connection, invisible yet undeniable, a spiritual thread woven into the very fabric of her being. The open loops of the past, the questions of coexistence, were not entirely closed, but a new path had been laid, a different trajectory set. The resolution was not an end, but a quiet, hopeful beginning, a testament to the power of a single, human act to ripple outwards, transforming not just lives, but the very understanding of the land itself. The symbolism of water, of life offered, and journey completed, resonated through her every breath. A silent, enduring testament to the profound interconnectedness of all things in the vast, beautiful, and endlessly complex desert.